Welcome to the Global Caramelization Initiative webinar series. My name is Dr. Diana Bogiva and I'm the GHI Working Group Director. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar discussing food and consumer perception regarding alternative proteins. This webinar is hosted by the GHI Consumer Perception Working Group, a group aiming to promote the investigation of consumer behavior regarding food safety, food security, and food legislation, and contribute to a sustainable consumer-driven food supply chain. I'm actually particularly happy for this webinar to take place today, and not only because I'm personally involved with the creation of the GHI Consumer Perception Working Group, but also because this is the newest formed group of GHI, and its members are very enthusiastic. And actually, this is the first part of the two-part webinar prepared by the Consumer Perception Working Group. The second part will be delivered on the 5th of December, so please stay tuned about it. As I mentioned, this webinar will explore the specific issues on consumer perception of alternative proteins. Not to waste any more time, let me introduce you our wonderful speakers today. Dr. Christelle Boumitri. She's an associate professor of food science at Notre Dame University, Louis, Lebanon. The speaker is Professor Dr. Diana Banati from Faculty of Engineering from Institute of Food Engineering and Vice Dean of Science at University of Szeged, Hungary. Quickly to run through the format of our webinar. After each talk, you have the opportunity to receive answers to all your questions, so please ask as many as you wish and we will make sure they are all addressed. Also, we will be running interactive polls during the webinar with the audience, and you have the link displayed on your screen, and also you have a minute to answer the poll. I would like to encourage your prompt participation. Before we continue with the talks, I would like to particularly thank ICC for providing the platform for this webinar and the conversation with you, the audience, and all what is going to happen in the next hour and a half. Big thanks also goes to Dr. Gerhard Schleining and Dr. Nicholas Stanley of our GHI Communication Director. Without the help of these two people, the webinar will be not as enjoyable as they are. And also thanks to our team member, John, as well. John Tank, thank you to all of you, our audience. You always rock. Please join us and be tuned for our webinars. Please join me to welcome our first speaker today, Dr. Christelle Boumitri. She's an associate professor of food science at Notre Dame University, Louis, Lebanon, who will be talking about consumer perception of alternative proteins. She received her PhD degree in food science and agricultural chemistry from McGill University of Quebec, Canada. And she's a certified preventive control qualified individual to develop risk-based food safety management system as awarded by the Food Safety Preventative Control Alliance in the United States. And now, welcome Dr. Christelle Boumitri, and over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Diana. Hello, everyone. It is my pleasure today to be talking about consumer perception of alternative protein. I would like to thank the GHI for having and hosting this webinar, and thank all the panelists who worked so hard to do this webinar. So, as I mentioned, I will be talking about consumer perception of alternative protein. So, in general, I will introduce alternative protein without going a lot into detail, just to tackle later on the consumer perception and the development of these novel foods. And will highlight some really recent evidence on consumer perception before I wrap it with some key messages and research opportunities. I'm not sure if you have heard, on the 15th of November, the UNFPA launched that our Earth is a home for 8 billion people. And actually, this world population is projected to reach 9.7 billion by 2050. And in order to feed this population in the year 2050, there will need to be more food, 70% more food, that must come from more sustainable sources using efficient technologies, which will require to investigate in novel foods, and especially alternative protein sources that are animal-free protein, such as plant-based, insect-based, cell-based or alga-based or cultured meat alternative. For that reason, I'm going to stop a little bit for a quick pause.
So if you have to swap meat for an alternative protein source, which of these would you choose? And click any that apply. So plant-based, cultured meat, insect-based, algae-based, and microbial, such as bacteria or fungi. And you have a minute from now. Okay, that's it. Thank you, everybody, for answering those questions. Back to Crystal.
Cool. So let's see, what are these alternative protein sources? So starting by the plant-based. The plant-based protein are protein extracted from plant-based sources, and mainly it turned out that pulses could generate a lot of protein. And the United Nations, actually, they celebrate the World Pulses Day, and the FAO recognizes so far 11 different types of pulses. And using these grains, we can produce substitute of milk and dairy products. We can also produce any substitute of meat that are already in the market. The insect-based, I'm not going to talk a lot about it because Dr. Banati will be talking about it in a few minutes. So the insect-based could be either consumed as insect as is, or produced in a flour and integrated into the food. So maybe it could look gross for some people. However, if this ingredient go hidden, maybe consumer will change their mind. Recently, I came across a literature review about the potential use of these edible insects in complementary food for children. And this literature review assessed 12 different previous studies where they use these edible insects in the children's food. And it turned out that these food that are complemented, they exceeded the dietary recommended intake of protein and fat as compared to other children complementary food. They have good acceptability. However, based on 2 studies, no effect on the reduction of stunting and wasting were observed. And when I assessed the different legislation of the insect-based food, it turned out that it's still conflicting or ambiguous in different regions or continents. Actually, in Canada, it's still pending. In the USA, they consider having insect as a defect, and they have an acceptable defect limit. However, we can see some insect-based products in the market. In Europe, for example, they have regulation regarding novel food, which cover the insect-based food. And the introduction of these products is different across different countries in the EU. In Asia and Africa, insect-based are a little bit into the traditional diet, so they have more advanced legislation framework. When we talk about the alga-based, it could be either the microalga or the seaweed. In both cases, they are cultivated, harvested, and the protein is extracted by disrupting the cell and are eventually used as meat substitute or in a different application. Based on findings, the alga-based products are considered efficient source of protein They are easy and fast to grow, versatile, beneficial to ocean ecosystem because they absorb carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus, and produces high amount of protein with high quality. And even they have good amino acid profile, which have better digestibility. And it doesn't require fertilizers, pesticides, and fresh water or land. As for the cultured meat, we can also call it clean meat, lab-grown meat, or mock meat. In all cases, we have to extract a primary cell from an animal source. Then this cell is established, proliferated in order to increase its number, and differentiated to produce unstructured meat, or like the minced meat that could be used eventually in burgers, for example. Or it could be either bioprinted in order to form structured products such as steak. Recently, the FAO and WHO called 24 experts from 15 countries to assess the safety of these cell-based food. Very recently, it was between 1 and 4 November 2022. And it turned out that these products have the same risk as with the conventionally produced food. Moreover, it turned out that if those products are contaminated with bacteria, they will not actually produce or proliferate, so which is considered safe as a whole product coming out of the fermenter or out of the bioreactor. However, what should be taken into consideration is the good manufacturing practices, good hygiene practices, and HACCP, which is the same as any food product. As for the consumer's perception, it turned out, or it is projected, that the consumption will go into 3 different waves, starting by the consumption of plant-based, followed by microorganism-based, and last, the animal cell-based. And we're going to see, based on your poll, what you decide as well. We're going to compare these data at the end. And the forecasted market value of plant-based meat worldwide, it is estimated to reach $35 billion by 2027, which is almost the double of today's market. Several companies are investing in R&D in order to develop these kinds of alternative sources of protein, such as Beyond Meat, Nestle, Unilever, Kellogg's, Conagra brands. So the question will remain as to what is really driving this development or this big hype. Is it the role of the producers who are actively producing, or the investors who are seeing promising returns and are putting a lot of money into this business, or it is actually due to the rise of interest in growing awareness or the development of these products, or coming up with the novel products? Or is it the action of governments also to prioritize, label, and regulate these products? And finally, the question is about consumers. So even if the whole wheel is running without consumers accepting, willing to purchase, actually going and buying these products and having interest in these products, maybe this wheel will not turn enough. Therefore, we need to understand the consumer perception and the consumer concerns, especially as to look at different questions. Are the consumers looking at these products as healthier, safer, cheaper, more sustainable? How they look at it? So the consumer perception is not something very simple. We have to consider the awareness, the impressions, the opinion. And how this is translated into willingness to pay, intention to try, intention to purchase, or even the self-reported behavior as like going actually to the supermarket and selecting a product among other products, even if we have different choices, how they select these products. So it's so complex that the working group on consumer perception at the GHI consider all these factors and how they influence the consumer perception. So if you look at this wheel, it was drawn by the working group, and it shows how the consumer perception is multi-layered, and we have various factors that can promote or they can stop a consumer from accepting these products. So when looking into the literature, it turned out that understanding the consumer perception regarding alternative protein is very difficult, I would say, or it is so complex, to the extent that there is now 12, it's not 11, because there is one addition systematic review that was published in November 2022. So there is 12 different systematic review conducted on the understanding of consumer perception related to alternative protein. And these literature reviews, they addressed different articles. So we have articles, up to 110 previous articles published between 1993 and 2018. This was assessed by Garza in 2019, and for example, Olsen in 2021 assessed 91 different previous articles. So now I will be showing a little bit some of these results, and will be discussing the most pertinent ones. First of all, when we are looking at these different previously published papers, it turned out that most of them, they assess the consumer perception regarding insect-based food, followed by cultured meat, and to a lesser extent the pulses, plant-based, and alga. And most of these papers were published in Netherlands. It is considered that the Netherlands is currently the most developed market. And most of other papers are in European countries, and only a few in the United States and in Australia. There are some, like 1 or 2 papers published in Korea and China, in Bangladesh as well. So based on all these papers, the overall acceptance of alternative protein is still very limited, especially when consumers are asked to compare these alternative protein to traditional proteins. For example, when asked if they are willing to purchase a steak or a burger, rather farm-raised or plant-based, cultured meat or nothing, most of the people would select the farm-raised beef. And the market, therefore, for plant-based is still very limited as to between 15 and 23. Noting that in these papers, they didn't assess if consumers are willing to accept insect-based meat. In other studies, where comparing plant-based meat, cultured meat, and insect-based meat only, without comparing it to a traditional meat, it turned out that consumers most likely would prefer the plant-based meat, followed by cultured meat and insect-based meat. And when assessing the plant-based snack versus algae and insect, it turned out that most consumers would prefer or would accept the plant-based snack as compared to the other ones. And people would actually prefer the plant-based protein toward the highly processed animal-based protein or the novel protein extracted from animal-based. So this would be the only conditions where they would prefer the plant-based protein rather than animal-based protein, because they are driven by the naturalness of the plant-based as compared to the highly processed or the novel animal-based protein. And males are more likely to accept insect-based protein, while females are more likely to accept the plant-based protein. Moreover, the market for plant-based protein is still higher in the USA as compared to Europe. Assessing all the drivers or all the motives that would guide the consumer to accept or not accept these alternative protein, Ozan did a huge summary table about this, and it turned out, I'm gonna summarize it without talking about each. In general, the taste, health, and environment, attitude, and social norms are drivers for pulses and plant protein meat, while we have to add to these the food neophobia for alga, and we have also to add discuss the fear, the food neophobia, and for the insect-based, and naturalness for the cultured meat. However, even based on this huge study addressing 91 different previous papers, Ozan was not able to draw a real conclusion as to what will motivate consumers to consume these products and what will stop them. So it was a general study about all these factors, because some of them would see it like positive drivers and some of them will see it negative drivers. So, for example, this study conducted in Korea among Korean participants, 500 different participants were asked about their acceptance to consume cultured meat, and another 500 participants were asked about their acceptance to consume plant-based meat. And here we need to say that those participants were selected separately in time, and not the same participants were asked about cultured meat or and plant-based meat. And the overall conclusion showed that some factors related to ethical viewpoints, food safety, and initial reaction would be positive, and some other would be negative drivers, such as sustainability, drug-free or cleanness, and food curiosity will be positive drivers. They will drive the consumer to consume more these products, whereas being unnatural or not trusting the biotechnology or these process to produce these food, and having already food neophobia are negative drivers for these products. The systematic review of Nguyen addressed all the factors that promote the acceptance, the motivation, and the opportunity of these alternative protein. And the overall results show that not having cooking skills is already a barrier to the acceptance of alternative protein. And expanding the concept of meat is also a barrier. What does it mean, expanding the concept of meat? It means that if you give a person the opportunity to change from consuming meat, maybe he will not grab it. Or for him, he doesn't want having a product that will expand the meat. I will elaborate a little bit further in future slides. Other factors are both facilitators and barriers. For example, the motivation for health, ethics, and sustainability are both facilitators and barriers. So there is no common conclusion about this. Whereas being vegan or vegetarian is a facilitator. Having the alternative protein as a hybrid form is a facilitator, which means that if you add the ingredient to a product that is already an animal-based, to extend that product or to increase the protein level, it is perceived better by consumers. Also, consumers who accept alternative protein, they are more motivated to buy it, and having awareness or educational campaigns, it will increase the motivation and capability. So I was talking about the meat substitution or reduction. Lovers of meat are not willing to change or to substitute using alternative meat products. This is based on different previous studies. Actually, consumers do not tend to use meat substitute to reduce meat consumption. They prefer to eat smaller portions of meat or organic meat instead of using alternative protein. The intention to reduce meat consumption was not a significant predictor of willingness to consume insect burgers or buffalo worms. And for low or no meat consumers, greater consumption of plant-based protein sources is not evidently associated with lower meat intake. And finally, the currently available products are not perceived as equivalent alternative for meat. So this shows that there is still a lot of room to work on consumer perception and to work on developing alternative for meat. But as I already mentioned, that the drivers to promote going into the direction of alternative meat is to combine alternative protein with animal protein, as it is perceived more familiar. And the taste of this hybrid insect burger, for example, is better as compared to other products without having this hybrid form or this reduction. And finally, the plant-based alternatives are the most popular hybrid ingredient due to its associated health benefits and sensory appeal, as to the color, the flavor, and the texture. So the key messages out of all these findings, so to date, many consumers still struggle to replace animal products. The market share for alternative protein is still limited, and plant-based are the most accepted while lab-grown are the least. The demand for plant-based alternative is increasing at a rapid rate, especially with the rising of the trends for flexitarian, vegetarian, and vegan population worldwide. And much effort should be focused on the technologies used and the production of or least processed product, because people are looking for more natural alternatives. And there is also a lot of gaps in the literature about the consumer intention to purchase these products and the consumer behavior. Let me explain myself. So actually, even if on papers or in studies, they show they are open to try, maybe they will not eventually go and try it or go and purchase. So a lot of studies conducted or assessed the intention without showing or linking it with a behavior. or even if they link it with the behavior, it was on very specific products, such as, for example, the burger from different sources. So since there are still a lot of gaps and limitations in the literature, and to add to this also, so far, none of the studies conducted the same method among different populations around the world to assess their acceptability for alternative protein. And only few studies assess the acceptability of all these alternative proteins together. So you may see some studies comparing only pulse-based versus lab-grown, or pulse-based versus animal product, without addressing the acceptance of all these alternative proteins combined. Therefore, like some future research could be conducting the same assessment across different countries and cultures. Moreover, without forgetting, there is also a need to understand the acceptance in developing countries, especially, for example, in the MENA region, where there is complete lack of this information or insight. Further, it would be interesting to get more insight about how the hypothetical measurements used in these studies will be actually translated to real-life consumer behavior, increase awareness about the benefit of consuming alternative protein, and promote harmonization of global food safety regulations and legislation for these alternative proteins. Having said that, I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and I would like really to thank Temitope Ekenemi and Romy Shammas for helping in getting these data, Dr. Diana Bogeva and the organizers for organizing this webinar, and thank you all for your attention.
Thank you very much, Christelle. I will give now the opportunity to Nicola to discuss the results of the poll with you, and we have a few questions for you to answer after that.
An interesting set of results. Plant-based was the most popular, with 90% of you agreeing that you'd be happy to choose plant-based alternative proteins as an alternative to meat. Then the others, we had cultured meat, 20%, insect-based, 20%, and also microbial such as bacterial and fungi, also at 20%. So not really something that you'd particularly want to choose at this moment. And algae-based was a little bit higher, coming in at 30%. So certainly plant-based was the most popular choice amongst you all at 90%. So thank you for your results on that. So I don't know, Crystal, if you want to comment on that at all?
Yes, I'm impressed to see that the plant-based has a good percentage. Actually, what should I comment? Can we know who are the audience to understand better why they selected the plant-based? And if in the tradition usually they use, because like plant-based or pulses are common in most of the cuisines, and we already consume them, but maybe we can change or make them more look like meat, or maybe use them as an alternative to meat.
It's also interesting to see that the algae-based is just a little bit higher on acceptance there against all the other alternatives there, cultured meat, insect-based, and other microbial sources. Interesting.
Yeah, it slipped my mind. I didn't say that algae is already consumed in Asian countries for many years.
Thanks a lot, Nicola and Christelle, for analyzing the polls. What also struck me with the plant-based, I agree that we are traditionally using plant-based in our everyday food to complement our food in some cases in combination with meat. but maybe a research that actually separate real whole foods, like real fruit and veggies and pulses and legumes and all of this, from the plant-based alternatives which were made by extrusion and chemical, fortification and other stuff. Probably such a research probably will be interesting to find out particularly why people are happy with plant-based option and what plant-based option they're happy with. Do you have this feeling that a research like this is needed or not?
Yes, definitely. Especially, it would be very important to assess how the technology can change the consumer perception, like choosing, for example, extrusion or fermentation, because the texture will change, the taste, the overall appearance or sensory properties could be altered.
Yeah, you mentioned that, display the drivers for consumer acceptance. But when do you think, if all of these drivers are kind of, imagine that they are all achieved, when in the future do you predict that we will have acceptance of different alternative proteins as a mainstream food for all consumers around the world, when they are going to become popular, like part of our diet, like other food that are currently part of our diet?
I don't see it far away. I don't. Yeah, I do. I don't see it far from now. However, what would be based on my studies and based on my discussion with other scientists, if they are able to produce it in cheaper cost as compared to the animal-based food, then I think people would consume it at a certain level. Because if you think now about soy, let's say soy is not considered as pulse nowadays. So if we think about the soy, the oat, or the rice milk, they are more expensive than the milk, right?
Yeah.
Even the cultured meat or the lab-grown meat is much more expensive than the beef.
They still can't actually reach the price parity with the conventional variant of these products. Yeah, correct.
Yeah. Then, if the price is similar, I think some of the population will accept it more, especially in developing countries or like people affected by hunger.
So why do you think that people will accept, made food produced like by chemical fortification or whatever, extrusion and whatever we mentioned, instead of continue with their normal diets and normal use of pulses, veggies and fruit? Why do you think that will happen? Developing country.
If you think about all the snacks that we eat or all the food that we have on the market, even if it is not alternative protein sources, they are full of these ingredients and they are over processed. So I think once people become familiar with these products, they will introduce it. Like if they see it a lot or have it in front of them in the supermarket, if we hear a lot of promotion about these products, it's gonna become something familiar and a driver for acceptance.
Thank you very much for these answers. I really hope personally that the alternative proteins are not going to become the next fast food or a very heavily processed food that we will be needing to choose to be part of our diet, but the future will show. Thanks again for your lovely presentation, Dr. Christelle Boumitri. And now we are going to our next speaker, Dr. Professor Diana Banati, from the Faculty of Engineering from Institute of Food Engineering and also Vice Dean for Science at University of Zeget. Not sure if I'm pronouncing it correctly, but Diana will correct me. And she will immerse us into the world of edible insects for human consumption. Just a little bit for Diana Banati. Following her graduation in food science and technology in Budapest, Hungary, she became a professor and earned university degrees in law, in teaching, and also she became the youngest Director General of the internationally recognized Central Food Research Institute, and this was for 10 years of her life. You can check all her biography in our GHI website. Over to you, Diana, and thank you for being our speaker today.
Thank you very much, Diana, for the kind introduction. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to be a speaker at this GHI Consumer Perception Working Group webinar. May I kindly ask you to read this QR code with your smartphone and fill the questionnaire, because with the Slovenian colleague, Dr. Ovča, we started kind of research on the opinion of edible insects of food professionals, and now we are extending it to other countries too. So probably next time I should be able to share the results of this survey. Talking about edible insects, it brings on the table environmental, technological, nutritional and food safety issues. Insects do have a beneficial role in nature as such, and they may have a beneficial role for humans as a source of protein. Although let's not forget that we already have products of insects in our life, silk, honey, for example. But obviously today we are focusing on edible insects as potential alternative sources of proteins. There are technological challenges we have to overcome, so edible insects are not widely ready for consumption, and probably most importantly, food safety aspects should be taken into account. And we do know that consumer perception may be a main barrier, the so-called disgust factor. In 2011, the New Yorker magazine had this photo on one of its articles saying that plentiful and protein-rich insects are food in much of the world. Why not here? They asked this question in North America, and obviously it would have applied to Europe as well. Now you see, save the planet, eat a bug type of messages more and more often. There was a milestone 2 years later when the Food and Agriculture Organization FAO published a document on edible insects about the future prospects for the food and the feed industry. So this is definitely not a new topic, but we are talking about novel foods. As I mentioned, insects do have an important role in nature. They are not only protein sources or potential sources of protein, but they are also pollinators in plant reproduction. They can improve the fertility of the soil via waste bioconversion, and they provide natural biocontrol for certain harmful pest species. They also provide a variety of valuable products, as I already mentioned, and for a very long time, people used the so-called maggot therapy as a kind of medical application. Insect consumption is nothing new. In huge parts of the world, in several Asian countries, African countries, and in Latin America, there is a 3,000 years history of eating insects, which is called entomophagy. We know that insects are rich in protein, and according to the United Nations, edible insects already provide food for at least 2 billion people worldwide in more than 110 countries. There are more than 2,100 different species of edible insects worldwide, and in many countries this is really a cheap source of protein. Insects, edible insects, are prepared in many different ways. In China, they are frying, braising, stewing, boiling, roasting insects. In India, they eat them mainly raw, boiled, cooked, fried as a chutney, roasted, steamed, and so on. In Thailand, you can find a lot of different types of deep-fried insects, and they also like to fry insects with spices and roast them. Excuse me. These days, insects are found on the menu in 5-star fine dining type of restaurants as a kind of novelty. Insects are also considered as superfoods, even though this is not a professional term, but you find insects on the menu, as I said, on many fancy restaurants. And in a country which is rather traditional, in Japan nowadays, they sell insects as snacks also for children. And you can find fried and sugared crickets, for example, or tarantula, as you see on this photo, which are sold not just in a capital as something extremely special, but you can find these type of products, processed food products, in many rural towns as well. They mainly sell spiders, crickets, weevils, and cicada. And you can also find so-called bug-based sushi in Japan, and there is a very well-known brand called Silk Food. Crickets are very popular in many countries because they are really rich in calcium, magnesium, zinc, iron, vitamin, dietary fibers. They are not only used as foods, but they can be processed into cosmetics, pharmaceutical products, and fertilizers. If insects are a cheap source of protein, why we do not consume them? Although there's a growing population which needs more protein-rich foods, and we know that insects are good sources of fiber, vitamins, minerals. In general, they are nutritious. They can be produced in a sustainable way, so it can be environmentally friendly. The conversion rate is very high, so they are highly efficient. They are already widely used, and they could also be used for the bioconversion of agri-food waste. So if there are so many positive aspects, why we do not still consume insects in most of the European countries? The biggest hurdle is the disgust or the fui factor. The taste sometimes is reported as neutral, but this was also amongst hurdles indicated by consumers. And let's not forget that in many countries there is a quite high level of neophobia, and people really think that we are what we eat, and they associate insect eating with a sign of poverty, or they see it as a sign of poverty. I already mentioned the term novel food. Novel foods are not only new type of foods, but a specific category in the European Union for which there is an extremely strict legislation. EFSA, the European Food Safety Authority, would perform a scientific risk assessment before the European decision makers would authorize the possible production of an edible insect into a food product. The yellow mealworm larva was the very first edible insect authorized in the EU. According to the legislation, once an insect is authorized, you cannot use it in any form. For each single edible insect authorized, the legislation would indicate whether it could be used in a frozen, dried, or powder form, and you can do milling after drying or milling in a frozen form or without treatment. The legislation also points out that for which type of foods could you utilize that particular insect. Just something interesting, for example, for beer, you can also add insect powder up to 2%. I am not so sure why would we add insect powder to beer, but this is also authorized. So besides the consumer perception point of view, we should also see what other type of factors may be barriers in the production of insect-based foods. As already said, food safety hazards are amongst the most important factors. These hazards should be assessed in a case-by-case approach, including microbiological contamination, chemical contamination, potential allergenicity, and let's not forget about the physical hazards. So, regarding microbiological contamination, there are bacteria, viruses, and especially insect-specific pathogenic bacteria, which type of hazards need to be handled. Regarding chemical contamination, there are mycotoxins, different type of toxins, heavy metals, and insecticide residues. Let's not forget about the anti-nutrients being present in insects, oxalate, tannins, etc. And toxic substances which are produced by the insects are also important elements, such as, for example, toxic hydrogen cyanide. Potential allergenicity is an important topic. There was a cost project called InfoGest in the European Union, where experts drew the attention of the decision makers of the allergenicity of insect proteins. And it is still on the table of scientists and that of the European Food Safety Authority. Physical concerns and hazards also exist. The choking hazard, wings, legs could cause harm once an insect is consumed in its original form, either fried or cooked. And we also have the non-digestible chitin from insects. So, would insects be safe sources of high-quality protein? We should focus on their heat treatment in most of the cases for detoxification. As I already mentioned, in some countries, some insects are eaten raw, but some specific species, for example, the African silkworm, have to be heat treated in order to detoxify it. Technological challenges. Although there are huge insect farms in numerous countries, in Europe, for example, the Netherlands, Spain, and Portugal were amongst the first countries which started to produce insects. But in nature-ending countries where, as I said, insect eating has a long history, insects are also harvested wild. There is so-called semi-domestication and farming, so insect production. It is very important what kind of rearing substrates are used, and according to the legislation, at least the European legislation, not all kinds of substrates can be used. There is a rather strict law on this. When insect farming is done, then obviously they try to improve the processing, the different steps of processing, like the blanching, chilling, and drying, which are the most important processes. And as I said, they use the different type of treatments, the heat treatment, for example, also for detoxification and reducing the microbiological load. And obviously, we would like to extend the shelf life of these insects. There's a lot of research going on the isolation of proteins and the different lipids, and trying to find the best suitable way for the extension of the shelf life. As the protein extraction and fractionation are necessary steps to produce ingredients derived from insect proteins. Obviously, research focuses on that. In terms of lipids, as most of the insect lipids are in a liquid form at room temperature, we call them insect oils, and these are rich in essential unsaturated fatty acids. Besides proteins and lipids, we do not often mention enzymes, but our knowledge on the genomic analysis of insects and the metagenomic analysis of the insect microbiota allowed us to identify those genes which are coding the enzymes, those kind of enzymes which could be used by the food industry. So this is also an important element. And as I mentioned, the chitin, which is non-digestible, but for example, chitosan is manufactured from chitin, and it is used by the food industry as a food thickener and also as a prebiotic and an antimicrobial agent, and as a semi-permeable coating, which would minimize the respiration and the water loss of different produce, different fruits and vegetables. And one of the food colorants, carmine, is also produced from it. In terms of consumer acceptance, as I said, the disgust is one of the main barriers, but I try to collect a few points from literature regarding the current trends. One of the main questions remain, if disgust is the main barrier, whether we should really try to convince consumers to consume insects, especially those consumers whom are currently unwilling to try. The answer, according to the studies, is no. We should more focus on those consumers and also those consumer age groups whom are more willing to try something new. For example, certain emotional responses would suggest that a group of food-evoked sensation-seeking consumers would be more open for this kind of experience. Sensory and consumer science should much more turn to optimizing the insect eating experiences for the potential so-called early adopters. And different studies came to the conclusion that consumer fear and disgust may diminish over time, but we definitely need an insect-inclusive legislation, a very clear one, and effective and efficient product development. Up to now, the majority of consumer research mainly focused on consumer acceptance as a primary psychological issue and sensory issues. And as it is not surprising for you, I guess, there is a general reluctance to consume insects or insect-based foods, or willingness to adopt them as a possible meat substitute. But those who remain more open for the trying of insects as a food source. For them, this kind of disgust factor is lower. They are low in disgust sensitivity, and also in these consumer groups, food neophobia is lower. They are more seeking for kind of sensation, mainly male consumers whom are in higher numbers familiar with eating insects. And obviously, curiosity for this consumer group and mainly young consumers remain definitely a motivating factor. There was a very interesting, really recent study in Italy where they studied the liking of different insect-based snacks among young consumers. And in 2 products, the insects were visible, and in 2 other, they were not visible because they used insect flour. And consumers had to evaluate these 4 products on a 1 to 9 sensory scale. And the chocolate bar with insect flour was the most appreciated one. It got almost 7 on this 1 to 9 scale. It was followed by whole crickets. It was surprising for me when I read. And then chips, which contained insect flour, followed. Then caramel worms had the lowest score, but it was still 6. The general distrust in new type of foods and the willingness to know all ingredients in a food negatively affected the liking of these products which were tasted. Also, when the whole insect was visible, then consumers did not like those products that much. So definitely further research is needed to improve the perception of insects as food among consumers. We will need to keep looking for alternative protein sources, and we have to improve the processing and also focus on the environmental impact of our protein production. Just something which may be interesting for you, that food journalist mentioned that an individual probably ingests about almost 1 kilogram flies, maggots, and other bugs each year without even knowing it. And if we think about whether we have ever eaten this kind of insects in and within or with our apple, cherry, or any other foods, then this is not that surprising to hear. And just an example, I already mentioned Japan earlier, and think back 20, 30 years ago, it was absolutely not usual to eat sushi in Europe. And today you can find sushi in almost every bigger retailer shop. So although insects are not yet widely available, in some countries there are different insect products on the market, but who knows, maybe in 20, 30 years, we will not talk about consumer perception issues anymore. And another thing is that consumers do not want to see anymore certain parts of the animals. For example, they don't want to see the heads of the chicken or the eyes of the fish. So it's understandable that they do not want to see the whole insect on their plate. But if we are going to explain the importance of edible insect as a protein source, most probably they will be more open to this. And finally, just about the market, the potential market growth, it is estimated that the edible insects market will grow by 47% between 2019 and 2026. And I would like to show you at the end an example which I believe is a good example. The fourth biggest retailer in the UK, the Morrisons, started to sell so-called zero-carbon, planet-friendly eggs. Whatever they have in their shops as a waste at the end of the day or end of the week, mainly vegetables and fruits, that waste is eaten by insects in huge containers, and the insects are eaten by hens, which produce eggs. And the University of Cambridge evaluated this product, and they validated it as a zero-carbon product. 3 tons of waste per week are put in different containers, and in every 2 weeks, the weight of the insects will be 5,000 bigger. So 1 container would provide protein for 32,000 free-range hens. And I think that this is a good example how insects could be used in the food chain in an environmentally friendly way. So finally, thank you for your attention. And as I said, we would appreciate if you filled up our survey. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Banati. I already filled in it, so hopefully the other people from our audience will follow in. So there are lots of questions that have to be answered. So the first one we'll start with, do you think including culinary skills in dietetics courses will aid their interventions to enable healthier diets?
Well, whether it would be a healthier diet, I'm not so sure. I think this is not the main point about eating edible insects. So it's
a more general question, but we promise to answer all the questions of our audience in general.
Yes, I think that here the need for more protein as one of the main driving factors, and to produce protein in a sustainable way, and this is much less about health. If you see consumers who are trying to reduce their meat consumption, it's much more likely that they would be willing to switch into a flexitarian diet than vegan and vegetarian. So, for example, those who started to eat plant-based meat alternatives, they are changing their diet not only for environmental, but in high percentage for health reasons.
Yeah.
But not in case of insects. That's my private opinion.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much for this. I totally agree with our previous presenter, Dr. Christel Bumitri, about the willingness of people to consume more plant-based than anything else. What is your feeling regarding insects? Because we know that traditionally insects were consumed by 2 billion people and still consumed, and these are around 2,000 species of insects around Africa, Southeast Asia, Australia still among Aboriginal people. So what do you think? People will kind of be the drivers for people to accept insects into their diets?
I think that people are, in general, are more and more conscious about the environment, about the way our food produced. Environmental concerns are growing, and younger generations are much more interested in environmental factors. There was a US survey, health survey conducted this summer, and I think 39% of the total sample mentioned environmental sustainability as a very important aspect. More than 70% of the Z generation said the same. So there's a huge generational gap, And I think it's going to be a really important factor for many, many consumers. And unless we will make a mistake like we did with several technologies like food irradiation, nanotechnology, biotechnology, GMOs, when we didn't explain clearly from the very beginning for the consumers why the new technology would be advantageous. So unless we will make this mistake and we will provide insect powder, insect flour, instead of whole insects, then
more in the blended form.
Exactly. Then I believe that not within 5 years, but maybe in 20 years, it will be much more acceptable to eat insects.
Yeah, and yeah, probably. But still, for the majority of consumers, they're feeling the yuck factor, and also the insects are still considered as a mere pest. So, It's a long way to go. As you said, maybe in the next between 5 to 20 years time, this could be, change in terms of the perceptions toward insects. Okay. Thank you very much for all your lovely presentation and all the answers that you gave us to the questions of our audience. I will invite now Dr. Nicola Stanley to do our last poll for today.
Hello, everybody. Right, we've got the second poll here. Gerhard, are you able to share that for us? Now, some of you that did the first poll will think it's very similar. It is very similar, but there are some subtle differences that we would like you to consider. So the question is, if you have to swap meat for an alternative protein source, which of these would you choose? And again, it's a multi-answer question, so click all those that apply, apart from that last question, because you don't have to choose any of them. If you want to stay with meat or an alternative source, then you can click on none of the above. So the options are plant-based, cultured meat, insect-based, and this time we've put algae together with fungi and bacteria for this question, so microbial sources, and then none of the above. And again, you have a minute to respond, starting from now. Thank you. The polling is closed now. So Gerhard, do we have any results there? Wow. Okay. So we've got a 85%. We had 90% before for plant-based. And if you remember, we had 20% for cultured meat, 30% for algae before, and we had 20% for bacterial and fungi. So the interesting thing on this one is we've got a little bit of a drop here. And some of you now are all saying, actually, you wouldn't want any of those alternatives. So you'd find something else, or you wouldn't move from meat, you'd stay with meat. So again, as Crystal mentioned before, plant-based is really very much the strongest contender here in the alternative protein sources. So thank you. And Diana, do you have any comments?
After I give the opportunity to Diana Banati to give her comments on the results, I have another question for her from the audience as well to be answered.
Okay, thank you. I'm not that much surprised. I believe that plant-based meat alternatives are rather popular these days. But let's not forget that as this is an upward trend in the European Union, it is already a downward in the US. So as much as this is an innovation, it could also be seen as a bit of a hype. So sooner or later, I guess that there will be a plateau. If you see now the growing consumption, I would have expected the interest in insect-based foods to drop much more. Once you talk about it, once you show the insects themselves. So hopefully it was not too horrifying what I said. And I would just re-emphasize that we should focus when talking to consumers on the powder form, on the flour made of insects, instead of the tarantula to be eaten in a fried form or things like that.
I'm sure some will enjoy the tarantula, and so it's good. People are still persistent, as Dr. Bumitri said, with the plant-based alternatives, and with insects now. Whatever you say, scary messages. I think that still the 2 billion people will continue eating the insects, and probably they will increase in number. The question from the audience that we have, and thank you, Nicola, for your help with the poll, and thank you everyone for answering this second poll. The question from the audience that we have for you, Professor Banati, is what are your take on the population of edible insects? Means, is their use doesn't affect the population or create any type of imbalance in the ecosystem?
From the ecosystem's point of view, I'm afraid that I'm not the good source to answer this question. I'm sure, because if the population is growing, and you already know that from FAO data that by 2030 and 50, there are different figures by how much the need for more, first of all, meat and more protein will be needed in Eastern Asia, for example, in the developing economies, then it's obvious that we will need to provide nutritious protein for people. So if we won't be able to do so by providing meat, and on the other hand we want to decrease our meat production and consumption, then we definitely need alternative sources, and it should not only be insects besides plant-based. I find, for example, algae as a very promising potential source too.
Thank you very much for this answer, and thank you very much, Dr. Christelle Bumitri, the Associate Professor of Food Science at Notre Dame University, Loiset in Lebanon, and Professor Dr. Diana Banati from the Faculty of Engineering Institute of Food Engineering and Vice Dean for Science at University of Szeged, Hungary, for your lovely presentations. Thank you very much for our audience being with us today. Thanks for Dr. Gerhard Schelling and also Dr. Nicola Stanley for assisting us with this webinar. And also thank you for our team member, John Tang. I hope everybody enjoyed this webinar, and we'll meet again at our second part of the Consumer Perception Working Group webinar. Thanks again, and stay tuned, alert, wanting to learn and achieve new things, and see you next time.